The report arrives at Führer headquarters on a grey January morning in 1944. It's a thin document, barely 30 pages, bound in the standard Wehrmacht intelligence format with red diagonal stripes marking it as streng geheim, top secret. The officer carrying it, a mid-level analyst from Foreign Armies West, has rehearsed his presentation a dozen times. He knows the numbers inside will not be believed. He places it on the heavy oak table in the map room at the Wolf's Lair, Hitler's Eastern Command bunker buried in the forests of East Prussia. The pages fall open to a chart, meticulously compiled from intercepted communications, aerial reconnaissance, and reports from agents still operating in neutral countries. At the top, a single line in typed German reads, "Estimated American tank production, calendar year 1943. Below it, broken down by month, by factory, by region, the numbers march down the page like an invading army. Detroit alone, 89,400 tanks. The officer knows that every tank division in the entire German army, Panzer and Panzer Grenadier, combined fields, perhaps 5,000 operational tanks at this moment. He knows that German industry, pushed to its absolute limit, produced 27,000 armoured vehicles of all types in 1943. He knows that the Americans, according to this intelligence, produced that many tanks in 4 months, from one city. If you're enjoying this deep dive into the story, hit the subscribe button and let us know in the comments from where in the world you are watching from today. The document will make its way up the chain of command. It will be analysed, cross-referenced, and questioned. Some will dismiss it as Allied disinformation. Others will stare at the numbers until the digits blur, trying to find the error, the misplaced decimal point that would make this nightmare make sense. But the intelligence is solid. It has been verified through multiple independent sources. The Americans are not just winning the production war. They are operating in a different reality entirely, one where the fundamental assumptions of German military doctrine have become historical curiosities. This is not the story of a battle. This is the story of the moment when numbers killed an idea. The idea had a name: Blitzkrieg, lightning war. It was a philosophy born from Germany's geographical nightmare surrounded by potential enemies, lacking the raw materials for sustained conflict, haunted by memories of the last war's grinding attrition. Blitzkrieg was Germany's answer to a question that had tormented its military planners since 1918. How do you win when you cannot afford to fight? The answer, crafted throughout the 1930s, was elegant in its desperation. You strike fast. You concentrate overwhelming force at a single point. You shatter the enemy's command. Structure before they can mobilize their full strength. You win in weeks, not years, because years are a luxury Germany cannot afford. You make tactical brilliance and operational speed substitute for industrial capacity. It worked. For a while, it worked brilliantly. Poland fell in 5 weeks in 1939. The Wehrmacht's panzer divisions punched through Polish defences, encircled entire armies, and reached Warsaw before the French and British could organise meaningful aid. The world had never seen mechanised warfare executed with such precision and speed. France fell in 6 weeks in 1940. The impregnable Maginot Line was simply bypassed as German armour poured through the Ardennes forest terrain the French had deemed impassable for tanks. Panzer divisions reached the English Channel, cutting the Allied armies in two. France, the victor of the First World War, surrendered while its army was still largely intact but utterly disorganised, psychologically, shattered by the speed of defeat. These victories seemed to validate everything. The doctrine worked. Quality and speed could defeat quantity and preparation. A smaller, more professional, more mobile force could destroy larger armies through superior tactics and coordination. The underlying mathematics of industrial production didn't matter if the war was over before the enemy could bring that production to bear. But there was always a calculation hidden in the doctrine, an assumption so fundamental that it was rarely stated explicitly. The enemy had to be defeatable within the window of Germany's limited resources. Blitzkrieg could win campaigns, but it could not win wars against opponents who could absorb the initial blow and keep fighting. It could not win against an enemy whose factories could replace losses faster than German forces could inflict them. The assumption was held in Poland. It was held in France. It was held in the Balkans and in Norway. It shattered in Russia. Operation Barbarossa, launched in June 1941, was supposed to be the ultimate validation of Blitzkrieg doctrine. The Soviet Union would collapse within 8 to 10 weeks. The plan called for 3 massive army groups to drive deep into Soviet territory, encircle the Red Army in massive cauldron battles, and reach a line from Arkhangelsk to Astrakhan before winter. The assumptions seemed sound. Soviet forces were poorly led, Stalin's purges having gutted the officer corps. Soviet equipment was obsolescent. The Red Army had performed dismally against Finland in 1939 and 1940. The initial advance exceeded even optimistic projections. By December 1941, German forces stood at the gates of Moscow, had besieged Leningrad, and controlled most of Ukraine. Millions of Soviet soldiers had been killed or captured in vast encirclement battles. By every traditional measure, the Soviet Union should have sued for peace or collapsed into chaos. Instead, Soviet forces counterattacked. The counteroffensive that winter should have been impossible. The Red Army had lost staggering quantities of men and equipment. Entire army groups had been destroyed. And yet new divisions appeared, equipped with tanks that had rolled out of factories evacuated east of the Urals, manned by soldiers conscripted from populations German intelligence had not known existed. The Soviet Union was not just surviving, it was reconstituting itself faster than Germany could destroy it. This was not how Blitzkrieg was supposed to work. The doctrine assumed that once you shattered the enemy's main force, you won. But the Red Army kept reforming. They lost 10,000 tanks in 1941. They built 11,000 new ones in 1942. They lost another 15,000 in 1942. They built 24,000 in 1943. German intelligence tracked these numbers with growing alarm. The implications were clear, but almost incomprehensible. The Soviet Union was winning through sheer material mass, absorbing catastrophic losses, and replacing them through industrial production on a scale Germany could not match. The Eastern Front was becoming exactly what Blitzkrieg doctrine was designed to prevent, a war of attrition where the side with more factories would inevitably win. But Soviet production, alarming as it was still comprehensible within German strategic thinking. The Soviets were dedicating everything to the war effort, stripping their civilian economy, running factories 24 hours a day, accepting crude but functional equipment designs that maximized production speed. The T-34 tank was effective precisely because it sacrificed crew comfort and manufacturing precision for mass production. Soviet industrial capacity was impressive, but it was understandable. They were doing what Germany was doing, just with more resources and less concern for quality. The American numbers were different. Reports of American industrial capacity had been filtering into German intelligence since 1942, but they were treated with skepticism. The figures seemed implausible, more propaganda than intelligence. America was far from the fighting. Surely they were not mobilizing their full industrial base. Surely the numbers were inflated. The officer at the Wolf's Lair that January morning in 1944 carried proof that the skepticism had been misplaced. The Americans were not just producing more tanks, they were producing more tanks while simultaneously building the world's largest navy, while constructing tens of thousands of aircraft, while shipping millions of tons of supplies to Britain and the Soviet Union, while maintaining a civilian economy that was actually growing. They were fighting a two-ocean war across the entire planet and treating it as a moderate inconvenience to their industrial base. Detroit, a single American city, had produced more tanks in 1943 than the entire German Reich. The report included comparative analysis. German tank production in 1943, approximately 27,000 armoured vehicles, including tanks, assault guns, and tank destroyers. American tank production in 1943, approximately 88,000 tanks, not counting the lighter Stuart and the armoured cars. The Chrysler tank arsenal alone, A single factory in Detroit that had not existed before 1941 was producing more medium tanks per month than all German factories combined. The numbers included something even more devastating: production trends. German production was increasing, yes, but slowly, constrained by labor shortages, raw material limitations, and the disruption of Allied bombing. American production was not just larger, it was still accelerating. The curves on the graph diverged like roads heading to different destinations. And this was just tanks. The report's appendices covered aircraft production, where the disparity was even worse; naval construction, where American shipyards were launching escort carriers faster than German U-boats could sink them; artillery production, truck production. The Americans had motorized their entire army while German forces still depended primarily on horses for logistics. The wealth was so vast, so incomprehensible, that it defied traditional strategic analysis. Blitzkrieg doctrine assumed scarcity. It assumed that armored vehicles were precious assets to be carefully husbanded, that losses mattered, that industrial capacity was a constraint that shaped what was possible on the battlefield. The doctrine was built on the foundation of German industrial reality, where every tank took weeks to build and represented a significant investment of limited resources. The Americans were operating under different rules. To them, tanks were not precious. They were disposable. If they lost 100 tanks taking a position, they would have 100 replacement tanks the following week. Their armor tactics did not prioritize preservation because preservation did not matter. They could afford to trade steel for time, to accept casualties that would cripple a German panzer division and simply replace the losses. This was not a war Germany could win through tactical brilliance. You cannot outmaneuver an opponent who can afford to be everywhere simultaneously. You cannot achieve decisive breakthroughs when the enemy can plug every gap with fresh divisions equipped with new tanks. Superior tactics become irrelevant when the opponent has 10 times your resources and can afford to learn through expensive mistakes. The officer presenting the report that morning could see the implications spreading through the room like cold water. Some of the assembled staff officers tried to find silver linings. German tanks were qualitatively superior. The Panther and Tiger tanks outclassed the American Sherman in armor and firepower. But the report addressed this too. The Americans knew their tanks were inferior in direct combat. They did not care. They had enough Shermans that they could accept unfavorable loss ratios and still win through attrition. 5 Shermans for every Panther was a trade they could sustain indefinitely. Germany could not. The doctrine that had conquered most of Europe in 3 years had become obsolete, not through tactical failure, not through operational mistakes, but through the simple mathematics of industrial production. The Lightning War had met an opponent who could weather any storm and respond with thunder of their own. And this intelligence was already 6 months old. What were the Americans producing right now, in January 1944? What would they produce in 1945? The numbers on the page offered no comfort. Only certainty. The war was already lost, not on any battlefield, not through any specific campaign, but in the factories of Detroit, in the shipyards of Philadelphia and San Francisco, in the aircraft plants of Seattle and Los Angeles. Lost in places most German soldiers would never see, producing weapons in quantities German industry could never match. The question was no longer whether Germany could win. The question was whether anyone in the room had the courage to say it out loud. The intelligence did not arrive in isolation. It was part of a pattern that German analysts had been tracking with increasing dread throughout 1943. Every source, from neutral diplomats, from technical journals that American industry published openly, from interrogations of captured airmen, from aerial reconnaissance of American ports, told the same story. The United States had transformed itself into something unprecedented in human history. An industrial colossus that treated war production as a secondary use of its manufacturing capacity. The reports were almost absurd in their specificity. The Ford Willow Run plant, built in 1942, occupied 67 acres under one roof and produced a B-24 Liberator bomber every 63 minutes at peak production. The Kaiser shipyards in Richmond, California, were launching Liberty ships 10,000-ton cargo vessels in an average of 42 days. One ship, the SS Robert E. Peary, was launched just 4 days and 15.5 hours after its keel was laid, a publicity stunt that nonetheless demonstrated capabilities that bordered on the fantastical. German intelligence officers cross-referenced these reports obsessively, searching for exaggeration and propaganda inflation. They found instead a disturbing consistency. American industrial journals published production figures openly, treating them not as military secrets but as business news. Corporate annual reports detailed tank and aircraft production with the same casual transparency as automobile sales. The Americans were not hiding their capacity, they were advertising it. The Chrysler tank arsenal represented a microcosm of the larger impossibility. Before 1941, Chrysler had manufactured automobiles. When the United States entered the war, the company converted a partially completed automobile factory into a tank production facility in 6 months. By July 1942, it was producing tanks. By December 1943, it was producing more than 2,500 M4 Sherman tanks per month from a single plant. 2,500 tanks per month. From one factory, the entire German war economy produced approximately 2,300 tanks per month in 1943, and that was from dozens of factories operating at maximum capacity, using forced labor, stripping civilian industries of resources, and accepting increasingly severe shortages in consumer goods. The Germans were working themselves to exhaustion to match what one American factory accomplished as a matter of routine production. The comparison extended beyond mere numbers. German tank production was constrained by skilled labor requirements. Building a Panther or Tiger tank required experienced metalworkers, precision machinery, and careful assembly. American production was designed around unskilled labor. The Sherman tank used simplified components that could be manufactured by workers with minimal training. Parts were standardized across multiple manufacturers. Assembly was broken into simple, repetitive tasks. The Americans had applied the mass production principles of Henry Ford's automobile assembly lines to military equipment, and the results were devastating. Where German factories carefully crafted individual tanks, American factories stamped them out like consumer goods. Where German doctrine emphasized tank-quality thicker armor, more powerful guns, superior engineering, American doctrine emphasized quantity and mechanical reliability. A Sherman might be inferior to a Panther in direct combat, but the Sherman could be, produced 5 times faster, was far less likely to break down, and could be repaired in the field with common tools and readily available spare parts. The strategic implications cascaded through every level of planning. The Eastern Front was consuming German armored forces at an unsustainable rate. The Red Army had learned from early defeats and was employing deep operational warfare with massive concentrations of armor. German panzer divisions were being ground down not through tactical defeat but through attrition. Losses that would have ended campaigns in 1940 or 1941 were now routine. Divisions that had swept through France were shadows of their former strength, and now the Western Allies were preparing to invade France. The intelligence reports made that clear. Massive forces were assembling in Britain. The question was not whether an invasion would come, but when and where. And when it came, it would be supported by American industry's full output. Every lost tank would be replaced. Every depleted division would be reinforced. Every tactical victory would be temporary, because the Americans could afford to lose and return stronger. The meetings at Führer headquarters throughout early 1944 returned repeatedly to these numbers. Hitler had been presented with the intelligence, had read the reports, and had seen the comparative analysis. His responses varied between denial and rage. He questioned the sources. He demanded new assessments. He insisted that German technical superiority and fighting spirit would overcome material disadvantages. When presented with the mathematical certainty that German production could not match American output, he shifted to arguing that American soldiers lacked the will to accept casualties, that the democratic powers would collapse under the strain of losses. But even Hitler could not entirely ignore the implications. His strategic directives in early 1944 reflected a grudging acknowledgement of reality. The Blitzkrieg operations that had characterized 1939 through 1941 were no longer possible. The Wehrmacht was shifting to defensive warfare, fortifying positions, trying to make the Allies pay such a high price for every mile of territory that they would eventually seek a negotiated peace. It was a fundamental reversal. The army that had been designed for rapid offensive operations was being forced into a defensive posture for which it was poorly suited. Blitzkrieg doctrine had no provisions for sustained defensive warfare because the entire point of the doctrine was to avoid such situations. Germany was now fighting exactly the kind of war it had spent 2 decades trying to prevent. A long, grinding conflict where industrial capacity determined outcomes. The officer corps understood this more clearly than Hitler. Many of the professional military men who had crafted the Blitzkrieg doctrine and executed it so brilliantly in the rote war's early years could see the endgame. Some, like Colonel Claus von Stauffenberg, would eventually conclude that the only way to save Germany from total destruction was to remove Hitler and seek peace. The July 20th, 1944 plot, the famous Valkyrie conspiracy, was motivated in part by the recognition that the war was militarily unwinnable and that continued resistance would only increase German suffering. But in early 1944, such conclusions remained private. Publicly, officially, the war continued. Orders were issued, divisions were moved, defensive positions were prepared. And in the factories of Detroit, the assembly lines kept running. If you find this story engaging, please take a moment to subscribe and enable notifications. It helps us continue producing in-depth content like this. The cognitive dissonance was extraordinary. German commanders at every level knew, in some abstract way, that they were facing materially superior forces. They had known this since at least Stalingrad. But knowing in abstract terms that the enemy has more resources is different from confronting the specific, documented reality that a single American city outproduced your entire nation. The psychology of military command depends heavily on the belief that victory is possible, that tactical skill and operational excellence can overcome challenges. The German officer corps was among the most professional in the world, steeped in military history, trained in operational planning, and experienced in mechanized warfare. These were not men prone to defeatism or panic. They had won spectacular victories against numerically superior forces. They had repeatedly demonstrated that quality could triumph over quantity. The Detroit production figures represented something different, not just quantity, but quantity so overwhelming that it negated quality. It was not a problem that could be solved through better tactics or superior operational planning. It was a structural reality that rendered traditional military thinking obsolete. No amount of tactical brilliance could compensate for a 10-to-1 disadvantage in equipment production, especially when that disadvantage was growing worse each month. Some officers coped through compartmentalization. They focused on their immediate tactical situation, on the battles they could influence, and avoided thinking about the larger strategic picture. Division commanders worried about their sector of the front, regiment commanders about their immediate objectives. The war became a series of small problems to be solved, rather than an overall situation to be comprehended. Others turned to increasingly fantastical hopes, the Wunderwaffen, the wonder weapons. If German technology could produce revolutionary weapons, perhaps the material disadvantage could be overcome. Jet aircraft, ballistic missiles, new types of submarines, these programs consumed scarce resources, based on the premise that a technological leap could change the fundamental calculus of the war. The V-2 rocket program alone consumed resources equivalent to the entire Manhattan Project. Thousands of engineers and technicians worked on jet fighter development when the Luftwaffe desperately needed conventional fighters to contest Allied air superiority. These programs produced impressive technology, but they could not produce it in the quantities that would actually affect the war's outcome. A handful of jet fighters could not contest an enemy who was fielding thousands of conventional aircraft. Revolutionary weapons produced in small numbers were symbols of technical prowess, not instruments of strategic reversal. The bitter irony was that Germany had, in some ways, facilitated its own predicament. Before the war, German industry had provided machine tools, manufacturing expertise, and technical knowledge to nations around the world, including the Soviet Union and even, indirectly, to American industry. German engineering was world-renowned. The precision manufacturing techniques and industrial processes that made German weapons superior were innovations that spread globally. The Americans had learned from German manufacturing methods, then scaled them to a level German industry could never match. It was as if Germany had taught the world how to build a superior army, and the world had responded by building 10 of them. By mid-1944, the theoretical discussions about production capacity became concrete tactical reality. The Normandy invasion in June showcased American industrial power in its most concentrated form. The initial landings were followed by a sustained build-up that German forces could not prevent. Supplies flowed across the English Channel in staggering quantities. Within weeks, the Allies had established a logistical infrastructure in France that supplied their advancing armies with everything they needed. German forces in Normandy fought with the skill and determination they had demonstrated throughout the war. They inflicted serious casualties on Allied forces. They executed tactical counterattacks that temporarily stalled advances. Individual German units repeatedly demonstrated superior tactical performance on a man-for-man, tank-for-tank basis. It did not matter. Every destroyed Allied unit was replaced. Every lost tank was replaced. Every depleted ammunition store was replenished. The Allies could afford to fight attritional battles because attrition favored them. German defenders could win tactical engagements and still lose strategically because the Allies simply brought more forces, more tanks, more artillery, more supplies. The Falaise Pocket in August 1944 provided a particularly stark demonstration. German forces were encircled and subjected to overwhelming air and artillery bombardment. The pocket became a killing ground where German tactical skill was irrelevant against absolute Allied material superiority. When the survivors escaped, they left behind hundreds of destroyed vehicles, losses that represented an irreplaceable portion of Germany's remaining armour strength in the West. For the Allies, the destroyed German equipment in the Falaise Pocket was a tactical success. For Germany, it was a strategic catastrophe from which there could be no recovery. The panzers lost there could not be replaced in time to matter. The crews killed there represented experience and training that took years to develop. The Americans replaced their losses within weeks and continued the advance. The mathematical inevitability became obvious to everyone. On the Eastern Front, Soviet forces were systematically destroying Army Group Center in Operation Bagration, inflicting casualties larger than Stalingrad. In the West, Allied armies were advancing toward Germany's borders. In the south, Italy had already fallen. In the air, Allied bombers were systematically dismantling German infrastructure while Luftwaffe, forces, starved of fuel and replacement aircraft, could mount only token resistance. The war continued through inertia and Hitler's refusal to acknowledge reality. But among the professional officer corps, among the men who understood operational warfare, the conclusion was inescapable. The Detroit production report from January had been correct. The war had been lost not through any tactical or operational failure, but through the simple mathematics of industrial capacity. Blitzkrieg doctrine had assumed a world where wars were decided by initial campaigns, where speed and tactical excellence determined outcomes. That world had been made obsolete by American factories that could produce weapons faster than they could be destroyed, that could sustain losses indefinitely, that treated warfare as a production problem to be solved through manufacturing efficiency. The aftermath was not a single moment, but a slow, grinding realization that spread through the Wehrmacht command structure like a chronic illness. Throughout 1944 and into 1945, German forces fought with the professionalism and tactical skill they had always demonstrated. But the context had changed. Every battle became a delaying action. Every victory was temporary. Every retreat was irreversible. The production disparity that had seemed abstract in intelligence reports became visceral reality on the battlefield. German soldiers learned to recognize the sound of American artillery, the distinctive crack of the 105mm howitzers that accompanied every American advance. They learned that when American forces attacked, they attacked with ammunition in quantities that German doctrine considered wasteful. American artillery observers could call down barrages that expended more shells in an afternoon than a German artillery battalion received in a month. German tankers learned that when they destroyed American armor, replacement tanks appeared within days. They learned that American units could afford tactics that German forces considered suicidal, because the Americans could replace losses, while German forces could not. They learned that qualitative superiority became irrelevant when the quantitative disadvantage was so extreme. The psychological impact was corrosive. German military culture had always emphasized skill, training, and tactical excellence. The idea that these qualities could be negated by sheer material mass challenged fundamental assumptions about what military prowess meant. Officers who had built their careers on tactical brilliance found themselves in situations where tactics were almost irrelevant. No amount of clever maneuvering could compensate for the enemy's ability to be everywhere simultaneously, supported by endless supplies. Some units maintained morale through increasingly desperate faith in wonder weapons or political solutions. Others simply focused on surviving the next engagement, the next day. Desertion rates, previously almost unknown in the Wehrmacht, began to climb in the war's final year. Not because German soldiers lacked courage, but because they could see the futility of continued resistance. The officers who had sat in that meeting room at the Wolf's Lair in January 1944, who had read the Detroit production report and understood its implications, watched their predictions materialize with grim accuracy. The Wehrmacht was bled white through attrition that could not be sustained. Divisions existed on paper, but fielded battalion-strength forces. Tank units operated with a handful of operational vehicles. Infantry formations lacked basic equipment. Meanwhile, American and British forces advancing into Germany encountered supply depots stocked with equipment in quantities that seemed designed to mock German shortages. Allied armies moved with logistical trains that included fresh food, medical supplies in abundance, spare parts for every vehicle, ammunition for every weapon system. German soldiers, increasingly desperate for basic necessities, could see in their enemy's abundance the evidence of the industrial disparity that had doomed them. The final offensives of the war, the Battle of the Bulge in December 1944 and January 1945, represented Hitler's attempt to deny mathematical reality through will and operational daring. The plan was classic Blitzkrieg thinking: concentrate forces, achieve surprise, punch through the enemy line, capture vital objectives before the enemy could respond. In theory, it resembled the operations that had worked so brilliantly in 1940 and 1941. In practice, it demonstrated how completely the war had changed. The offensive achieved initial surprise and made significant gains. German forces displayed the tactical skill that had always characterized the Wehrmacht. For a brief period, it appeared that operational excellence might yet achieve something significant. Then American industry reasserted itself. Supplies flowed to the front. Reinforcements arrived. Allied air superiority achieved in part because American factories were producing combat aircraft in absurd quantities, turned every German movement into a gauntlet of aerial attack. The offensive stalled, then collapsed. The Wehrmacht losses in the Bulge offensive represented armored forces and trained personnel that Germany could not replace. The Americans replaced their losses and continued advancing. By spring 1945, the question was not whether Germany would be defeated, but how many more people would die before Hitler accepted the inevitable. German forces in the West surrendered in early May. Those in the East fought desperately to avoid Soviet capture, knowing that surrender to the Red Army meant probable death or decades in the Gulag. Berlin fell after savage street fighting that destroyed much of the city. Hitler committed suicide in his bunker on April 30th, 1945, still issuing orders to armies that no longer existed and commanding a military that had been destroyed not by tactical defeat, but by industrial mathematics. The final accounting was staggering. The United States produced approximately 300,000 aircraft during the war. Germany produced approximately 120,000. The Americans produced nearly 90,000 tanks and tank destroyers. Germany produced approximately 50,000 armored vehicles of all types. American shipyards launched nearly 6,000 naval vessels and built merchant shipping tonnage equivalent to the entire British merchant fleet's pre-war capacity. They did this while maintaining a civilian economy that grew throughout the war years. The production figures that had seemed implausible in the intelligence reports of 1943 and 1944 proved, if anything, to be conservative estimates. American industry had not just outproduced German industry. It had operated in a different industrial paradigm entirely, one where warfare was a systems engineering problem to be solved through manufacturing efficiency and logistical coordination. The Detroit production numbers that had landed on that table at the Wolf's Lair in January 1944 represented more than just tanks. They represented the obsolescence of an entire way of thinking about warfare. Blitzkrieg doctrine had been predicated on the assumption that tactical and operational excellence could overcome material disadvantages, that speed and skill could substitute for industrial capacity. The doctrine had been brilliant and effective when German forces faced opponents who could be defeated before their full resources were mobilized. Against an opponent who could absorb initial losses and then bury you under an avalanche of production, the doctrine became irrelevant. The Americans did not need to match German tactical sophistication. They could afford to learn through expensive mistakes, to accept unfavorable casualty ratios, to replace losses faster than Germany could inflict them. They could afford to be everywhere simultaneously because their factories gave them that capability. The lesson extended beyond World War II. The Industrial Revolution had been transforming warfare since the mid-1800s, but that transformation reached its logical culmination in the Second World War. The side with greater industrial capacity, more efficiently organized production, and better logistics would win prolonged conflicts regardless of tactical or operational skill. Technology and tactics still mattered, but they mattered within the constraints imposed by industrial capacity. Future military planners would have to account for this reality. The age of wars, decided primarily by tactical brilliance and operational art, was ending. Modern warfare was becoming a contest of industrial systems, logistical networks, and organizational efficiency. The romantic notions of military genius overcoming material disadvantages became historical curiosities, interesting examples of past thinking that no longer applied to industrial-age warfare. For the German officers who had built their careers on the doctrine of mobile warfare, who had executed some of the most brilliant campaigns in military history, who had defeated armies larger and better equipped through superior tactics and operational art, the end of the war must have been particularly bitter. They had not been outfought in any traditional sense. They had been outproduced. Their expertise had been rendered obsolete not by enemy skill, but by enemy factories. The intelligence officer who had placed that report on the table in January 1944, if he survived the war, would have had time to reflect on what those numbers had meant. They had been warning and prophecy, a glimpse of a future that was already inevitable but not yet fully realized. The numbers had shown that the war was lost before most people understood it had been decided. They had revealed that Blitzkrieg doctrine, for all its brilliance, was a solution to a problem that no longer existed in the form its architects had imagined. The 89,000 tanks from Detroit were more than weapons. They were the physical manifestation of a new reality, where industrial capacity was the ultimate strategic weapon, where sustained production determined outcomes more surely than tactical genius, where the romance of military art gave way to the mathematics of manufacturing efficiency. In the end, the lightning war met an opponent who could absorb any storm and respond with industrial thunder that never stopped. The doctrine that had seemed to rewrite military history became a historical footnote, a brilliant but ultimately inadequate response to the challenges of mechanized warfare. The factories of Detroit and Pittsburgh and Los Angeles had won the war years before. The last shots were fired. The battles were denouements, the working out of conclusions already determined by production curves and logistical capabilities. The German military establishment had understood this by early 1944. They had seen the numbers, run the calculations, and reached the inevitable conclusion. What they lacked was the power to act on that knowledge, to end a war that could no longer be won, to prevent losses that served no strategic purpose. They were trapped in a conflict that had already been decided by forces beyond their control, by the industrial capacity of nations, by the organizational efficiency of economic systems, by the mathematics of production that rendered traditional military thinking obsolete. The report gathered dust in archives after the war, one document among millions detailing the conflict. But in that moment, in January 1944, it represented something profound: the death of an idea, killed by numbers, mourned by no one except perhaps the men who had believed in it. Thank you for watching. For more detailed historical breakdowns, check out the other videos on your screen now, and don't forget to subscribe.